dive into the annals of history and discover the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict. As we journey back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a movement known as Zionism began to take shape. Zionism, fueled by centuries of Jewish diaspora and the desire for a homeland, sparked a wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine. This land at the time was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire and was home to a predominantly Arab population. While the Zionist movement gained traction, the world stage was being set for a significant shift. In the throes of the First World War, Britain, seeking support, issued what is now known as the Balfour Declaration in 1917. This document expressed Britain's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration, however, failed to take into account the existing Arab population of Palestine, a majority that had lived there for centuries. When the dust of the Great War settled, the Ottoman Empire was no more, and Britain was granted control over Palestine through the mandate system established by the League of Nations. This period, known as the British Mandate of Palestine, saw a significant increase in Jewish immigration, further fueling tensions between the incoming Jewish settlers and the long-standing Arab population. These tensions were further exacerbated by differing national aspirations. While Jewish immigrants sought a homeland in Palestine, the Arab population who had been living there for generations saw this influx as an invasion, threatening their own national identity and claims to the land. As the years rolled on, these tensions transformed into violent clashes, with both sides holding their ground, fueled by a potent mix of nationalistic fervor, historical claims, and religious ties to the land. This growing divide marked the beginning of a conflict that would span decades, a conflict that is still very much alive and unresolved today. And so, the seeds of conflict were sown, setting the stage for decades of strife. Fast forward to 1947. The United Nations votes to divide the land. The world was still reeling from the horrors of the Second World War, and the United Nations sought to resolve the escalating tensions in Palestine. The UN proposed a partition plan, a blueprint for dividing the land into two separate states, one Jewish, one Arab. This was a hugely significant moment, marking the international community's recognition of Jewish national aspirations. 1948 marks a pivotal year. The British mandate over Palestine comes to an end, and the State of Israel is declared on May 14th. This declaration is met with jubilation by Jewish communities worldwide, but equally with despair and resistance from the Palestinian Arabs and surrounding Arab states. The very next day, the First Arab-Israeli War breaks out. It's a bloody and brutal conflict, reshaping the geographical and political landscape of the region. However, while a new nation was being born, another was experiencing profound loss. For Palestinian Arabs, 1948 is known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. The creation of Israel resulted in widespread displacement of Palestinians. Hundreds of thousands were either driven from their homes or fled during the war, many never to return. This mass displacement of Palestinians is a critical and painful part of their collective memory and identity. It's important to understand that the creation of Israel wasn't a simple act of drawing lines on a map. It was a complex process, fraught with conflict, and accompanied by deep-seated feelings of loss and injustice. It was a time of jubilation for some and a time of catastrophic loss for others. The UN partition and the subsequent birth of Israel set the stage for a series of conflicts that continue to this day. The joy of one people's national rebirth was the sorrow of another's displacement. Two narratives, intertwined and inseparable, were born out of this period. The birth of a nation and the displacement of a people, a recipe for enduring conflict. As we delve deeper into the wars and intifadas that followed, we'll see how these early events continue to shape the realities of this region. In the ensuing decades, wars and uprisings became the norm. The landscape of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was marked by the scars of major wars and the echoes of countless intifadas. The Six-Day War of 1967, for instance, was a turning point. Within a mere 6 days, Israel had seized the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This territorial expansion further displaced thousands of Palestinians from their homes. A few years later, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 saw a coalition of Arab states launch a surprise attack on Israel on the holiest day in Judaism. Despite the initial shock, Israel managed to repel the attack, but the war further entrenched the division and resentment between Israelis and Palestinians. But it was the intifadas, or uprisings, that truly highlighted the plight of the Palestinian civilians. The first intifada began in 1987, sparked by decades of frustration and injustice. Palestinian civilians, armed with nothing more than stones, faced off against a highly equipped Israeli military. This David versus Goliath image resonated around the world, drawing attention to the injustices faced by Palestinians. The second intifada erupted in 2000, even more violent than the first. It was characterized by suicide bombings and armed attacks which were met with a heavy-handed Israeli response. This cycle of violence caused a significant loss of life, particularly among Palestinian civilians. In the shadow of these wars and uprisings, the plight of the Palestinian civilians worsened. Their homes were demolished, their lands seized, their freedom of movement restricted. They lived and continue to live under the weight of an occupation that shows no sign of ending. The wars and intifadas, rather than bringing resolution, have only deepened the wound that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They serve as stark reminders of the ongoing struggle for justice and peace in a land that has known far too much of the opposite. In the shadow of these wars and uprisings, the plight of the Palestinian civilians worsened. Hope flickers in the form of peace accords, but the flame of conflict refuses to die. This phrase holds true when we delve into the peace process between Israel and Palestine. The Oslo Accords stand out as a significant milestone in this journey, emerging in the early 90s as a beacon of potential resolution. These agreements, brokered largely in secret, aim to establish a framework for peace and self-governance in Palestinian territories. However, the promise of the Oslo Accords was never fully realized. The agreements were marred by both sides' failure to fulfill obligations and by violent outbreaks. The Camp David Summit in 2000 was another attempt to broker peace, with US President Bill Clinton mediating talks between Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. Yet, despite intense negotiations, the summit ended without an agreement, with both sides blaming each other for the failure. In the years following these attempts at peace, the situation has only worsened. Israel has continued its settlement activity, further encroaching on Palestinian territories. These settlements, considered illegal under international law, have only served to exacerbate tensions and fuel conflict. In Gaza, a humanitarian crisis unfolds. Blockades have led to shortages of essential supplies such as water, food, and medicine. The people of Gaza live under conditions that the United Nations has deemed unlivable, with the majority of the population reliant on aid to survive. The peace process has been a road filled with obstacles, with each step forward seemingly followed by two steps back. The continued settlement activity by Israel and the dire situation in Gaza underscore the urgent need for a just and lasting resolution. Yet, despite the challenges and setbacks, the pursuit of peace must continue. The cost of conflict is too high, and the need for justice too great. The quest for peace remains elusive, as injustices continue to mount. The present day paints a grim picture of a conflict without end. As we peer into the heart of the ongoing Israel-Palestine saga, the narrative is marred by the issues of settlements, blockades, and violence. Israeli settlements continue to expand into the West Bank, a territory recognized by the international community as Palestinian land. This encroachment not only breaches international law but also further restricts the movement of Palestinians, exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation. Then, there's the blockade of the Gaza Strip, a policy implemented by Israel for over a decade. This blockade has turned Gaza into what many call the world's largest open-air prison, where over 2 million people are mostly cut off from the outside world. Basic necessities like food, clean water, and medical supplies are in short supply, leading to a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. The cycle of violence, unfortunately, persists. Innocent Palestinian civilians, including children, bear the brunt of this conflict. The loss of life and the constant threat of violence have become an everyday reality, a grim testament to the state of affairs. But what of the international community, you might ask? Well, reactions have been mixed. While there is widespread condemnation of the settlements and the blockade, there is also a lack of effective action. Many nations voice their concerns, but few have taken any substantial steps to address the situation. The United Nations has passed numerous resolutions, yet the conflict remains unresolved. This, my friends, is the current state of the Israel-Palestine conflict. A cycle of violence, a litany of broken promises, and a people yearning for freedom and justice. As we look to the future, the hope for a just resolution hangs in the balance. This hope is not just for the Palestinians, but for humanity itself. For a resolution to this conflict is not merely about justice for one group, but a testament to our collective ability to resolve disputes peacefully and equitably. The history of this conflict is a stark reminder of our failures, but also a call to action, a plea for justice, and a beacon of hope for a better tomorrow.